Alrighty, I'm going to love question here. So I'm asking you to get right into Nozick's definition of love, and you should get that definition out there. It's right at the beginning of the chapter where he says what's common to all forms of love, and he talks about the tide well-being. So that should be familiar to us. Talk about that a little bit, and what does that ultimately amount to? Nozick himself gives us a little distinction with a preference, and it would be, I think, it would be beneficial to add that subtlety in your definition, that this idea of tide well-beings doesn't extend to preferences, and maybe say a little something about what does that mean. Clearly is kind of like we're off the hook, I guess literally, we're not like hooked in to each other at the level of preferences, so you don't have to have a similar kind of experience or view of your own life as your lover does through their preferences, only through their well-being. You do kind of need to see your life as part of the kind of, I guess, quality of it and your own well-being in your own life as partly a function of their well-being. So that's what it is to have that tide well-being. So I'm going to ask you to kind of get right into getting some counterexamples. So we did this in class. If you have notes from that day in class, you can go back and look. We looked at ways in which you could describe two people that are indeed in love, for sure. You have to just kind of make that, part of your example, part of the account. But they definitely don't have tide well-being. That would mean that tide well-being isn't a necessary condition for love if we can think of tide well-being without, if we can think of love without tide well-being, then obviously tide well-being isn't necessary for love. So that's one kind of counterexample. We would call that a necessity counterexample. So you think of love without what he's appealing to, this tide well-being. There's another kind of counterexample, which is tide well-being, yeah, but no love. That would be a sufficiency counterexample, where we would say this tide well-being thing, which Nozick talks about, isn't a sufficient condition for love, because you can see these cases where there is tide well-being, but there isn't any love. So it's not a sufficient condition for it. So you'd have to be able to come up with the cases. So I'm asking you here to construct two counterexamples, let's say one or two, whatever you can, to his definition. That's pretty much what Socrates tries to do in assessing the viability of his interlocutor's definitions. Like Euthyphro is essentially, proposing counterexamples or putting some kind of like logical pressure on the definition. And I'm essentially just kind of asking you to do that as a way of, testing it out. Does it pass the muster? Can we put some scrutiny on it and it doesn't fall apart? Or does it fall apart the moment we put some kind of logical scrutiny on it? So it seems like it's a decent definition. We came up with some counterexamples in class. Do note, this is, I think, a good case where you can have kind of more or less thoroughness. Do note that on the second page of the love chapter, he's got a long footnote at the bottom of that, and he gives the more complete, like 7-part criteria for this idea of having your tide well-being with another person. So, you could consider, this is what I would suggest, consider how Nozick could reply to the counterexample you've just proposed. And it's fine if he's got a reply. It's not kind of about who wins, but just seeing whether or not there's good responses to good questions. So maybe Nozick has a good response to some good questions you've raised. Maybe he doesn't. The place to look is, well, the book. So look at, the first couple pages of the chapter. Do take a look at that footnote, because that's exactly what he's trying to do there. He doesn't advertise it this way, but that's what he's doing, is anticipating potential objections that a reader might have by giving this kind of full account, which should kind of foresee the kinds of logical questions that philosophers would raise, like a Socrates, and he's here saying essentially, I've already anticipated your likely objections, and here I give the full account, which should be able to respond to your counterexamples. So right there, we've kind of got a nice opportunity to do philosophy about love, and doing really the same kind of like Socratic definition and counterexample thing, but interestingly enough with love. And that part of nozick gives you where to look for his potential replies. So then I do say, like, after it's all said and done, with the kind of scrutiny just on the definition, this is all a fairly focused scrutinizing of a very specific definition. So this is all kind of precise thinking with the counterexamples and the replies to counterexamples. How does it work at the end of the day? No definition is going to be perfect. I think especially something of love that's trying to capture what all love has in common. So it's a pretty ambitious attempt. How well does he do? I think he does pretty well personally. I can imagine there being some kind of needed tidying up or perfecting of the definition, but it seems like it's okay for me. But we could base that on like how easy it falls prey to counterexamples, and whether or not he's got any way to respond. So you could kind of just like that, and not really a big thing, but so now we're kind of transitioning to a different part here. So this autonomy and unconditional love thing, I didn't copy that right here, but I've got a brief note on this, on the full prompt, and we did this in class. We actually spent quite a bit of our class time on love talking about these two counterexamples, objections. So I'm not going to go over the content of those, but basically the kind of structure, the role that they play here. So they function as objections in it's like two ways, really. So the autonomy objection is roughly that since being in a we morally requires a forfeiture of some of your autonomous decision making to your beloved, it's not worth it. Being in a we isn't worth it, so goes the objection. Because of this loss of autonomy, love requires love of autonomy, at least being in a we does, so we'd be better off without it. So in a way, I guess it's kind of an argument for the single life. You could think of it that way. I don't necessarily believe that, but I could certainly see somebody that values autonomy greatly raising that kind of objection to Nozick's view, like, well, Nozick, on your account, looks like we'd be better off not being in a we because of that loss of autonomy, and you'd want to kind of like fill that in a little bit. Why is the loss of autonomy such a worrisome thing, or what might a person be thinking who made that kind of argument, right? So that's what I presented in class. So in class, we proposed some ways of responding, and I'll kind of leave that to you. I think there's probably a response to like why it is still worth being in a we, even though that requires the loss of something really quite important, autonomy. I mean, it's maybe like as important as anything. It's your freedom, right? So I think there's probably some good responses to that, but I would think there should be some response, right? If to show that love is worth it, should be able to come up with some way to explain why it's worth the cost or hit that we take in autonomy. Okay, so I guess that's kind of like a finding compensating benefits, or you might kind of deconstruct the objection itself if you kind of want to take a different role, different approach. So the unconditional love objection is a little different. The idea here is that we traditionally distinguish between some kind of like higher and lower kinds of love, and we often call that conditional love and unconditional love. Nozick seems to be calling it being loved for yourself and being loved for your characteristics, your qualities or something. Um, all of that seems to map onto, a pretty common intuitive difference that people see in different, meaningfully different kinds of love that we can have in our life. And I think most people would say there is this preferable kind, being loved for yourself or being loved unconditionally. The other stuff isn't terrible either. It's not like maybe number one, but it's good to have that kind of love in your life as opposed to none or whatever, if you can get it, and still kind of psychologically beneficial. And there's this kind of really fabulous, deeper, more meaningful kind. So the objection is that, and this is what I did in class again, if you use Nozick's definition of being loved for yourself as the definition of unconditional love, then an implication of that, these are bad implications, is that either unconditional love is impossible or it's random and arbitrary. It's kind of like, again, undesirable. And then in that way. But not because it's impossible, but it just turns out to be groundless or baseless. So I made those arguments in class. I'm not going to rehearse those, but that's the kind of argument here is if we use Nozick's definition of being loved for yourself as the definition for unconditional love, we get problematic implications. So you could call that like a reductio ad absurdum objection. And it's different from the autonomy objection, which is like, just too costly. Something like that, or like it's too much to give up, too costly. Okay, so then in class, again, we looked at ways in which that autonomy, the unconditional love objection could also be answered. And I think Nozick actually has the seeds of a nice answer himself when he says that, well, to be loved for yourself is to be loved for the properties in virtue of which you define yourself, or your kind of identity properties, we might call that, or the properties through which you identify as the person that you are, as you, what makes you you. That's what your lover should love in you, those very things that you say make you you. Then they're loving you. So I actually kind of like that view. There might be some odd implications to it, but you can bring that up. That at least is one kind of response that Nozick himself can provide to the unconditional love objection. We also looked at some accounts, so basically this is asking you to reconstrue the definition between conditional love and unconditional love, or the distinction between conditional love and unconditional love, reconstrue that in a way that doesn't lead to those problems that we noted in class. So it could be like that they love all of your properties taken together, and that's a kind of a unique thing about you, is not any single property about you, because other people in the world will have that property, but nobody has the exact full set that you do, and that kind of something more that full set amounts to, namely you, that's unique in you. So if somebody loves that, the full set of your properties, not just the ones that you take to be you, then that could be a way. And we looked at a couple other thoughts there. And really, as the end here, kind of at the end of the day, what do you think about the broad question, what is love? I would say, just kind of like give that as a parting shot. There's kind of a lot of conceptual labor involved in this essay. So you'll be pretty busy already, and you can just kind of give like a parting shot. Maybe a better way to actually even have phrased it for me as the person making the prompt could have been something like, what is some kind of specific aspect of love that you see clearly now, having gone through this full analysis? So that's a fine way to finish up. It might have been a better way to put it. Alrighty, so that'll do that.